Welcome to The Forest Garden, your guide to transforming your organic gardening practice into a holistic, edible forest garden landscape. If you have an interest in sustainable design, ecology, or regenerative agriculture, then this podcast is for you. On today's episode, we will be discussing the controversy surrounding so-called invasive plants. If you have ever planted something in your landscape only to regret it a few years later, or have considered introducing a specific plant species that you've heard a lot about but have been somewhat unsure, this episode is definitely for you. So please stay tuned and enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forest Garden Podcast with Ben Bishop and Mike Motto. So this episode I'm really excited about because we're going to talk about something that I'm really passionate about. I know Mike is really passionate about as well. We could probably talk for a really long time on this subject, and we will go into depth, but hopefully we won't break the 2-hour mark. I don't know how long this episode is going to go, but what we're going to be talking about is the controversy of invasive plants, exotic plants versus native plants and endemic plants. And there's really a lot to cover, but it's something that I think people feel really strongly about in one way or the other. We're going to both talk about the sort of philosophy of plant choice and species selection in forest gardens, as well as going actually into depth about the plants themselves and what makes native plants important, what makes invasive plants potentially problematic, but how it's not really as cut and dry as you would be led to believe. There's a lot of nuance to it. So we're hoping to sort of break a little bit into that in this episode and go a bit deeper than most sources will when it comes to this controversy. I don't really have a bias one way or another right now in terms of, you have like the native plant only people. Then you also have the permaculture folks who say basically any plant that serves a purpose to people can be appropriate given the right circumstances. I think both have merit, and it's sort of up to the individual designer to sort of make those decisions. What do you think, Mike? Are you a native only guy, or are you a permaculture guy, or are you somewhere in between?
Tough question. I suppose I would put myself somewhere in between, but I would first say that just to sort of talk about permaculture's view on invasives, it's not across the board. Everyone has their own opinion, obviously. It is interesting that there's any sort of pushback against the idea that invasives are bad for your environment, because obviously, we've seen invasives really wreck habitats. But to sort of set the stage for everyone, the reason why some people, potentially including myself and Ben, sort of consider the idea that invasives have a place in our landscapes is because invasives, just the nature of them, they're taking over ecosystems and really establishing themselves. If it's a plant that really is super useful for you in multiple different ways, and it's taking over the landscape, then that might not be a bad thing necessarily. However, it's important to keep in mind that invasive plants are really indicators of disturbance in ecosystems or disturbance in landscapes. When I say disturbance, I mean upturned soil, perhaps an area that has been tilled recently. Invasives are very similar to weed species in that they're opportunistic. So invasive plants are considerably less invasive in ecosystems that are really healthy in the first place. An ecosystem that is high functioning with an incredible amount of diversity, an invasive plant won't have as much of an opportunity to really take over in that landscape versus, I don't know, a recently clear-cut forest. There's this sort of point of view of, well, shouldn't we be looking to these plants in our ever-changing climate? Climate change is rapidly destroying ecosystems on its own. Perhaps these are the plants that will sort of save us from impending doom. That's generally the idea.
Actually, how would you define invasive plant? I mean, you just kind of touched on that in terms of growing aggressively and having some particular behaviors that may make it kind of accelerated in its growth habit. But do you have a particular definition or just a general thought on what makes a plant invasive? And can an invasive plant be a native plant?
So yeah, all good questions. First, I guess the first thing to start off with is basically all, most plants that are popular, especially vegetables in the US today, are not endemic to the US. Lots of people came to the US, mostly from Europe or other places, and brought seeds and plants with them. And then lots of them became naturalized in the landscapes that we live in today. There's examples of this all over the place. There's wild rhubarbs and wild asparagus and tons of wild species that at one point in time were potentially invasive. So that word, using invasive in that way, can be confusing. So before I talk about potentially my own opinion or personal definition of what an invasive plant is or can be, I'll just reference what the USDA has to say about it. They define an invasive plant as a plant that is both non-native and able to establish itself on many sites, grow quickly, and spread to the point of disrupting plant communities or ecosystems, which is a good definition, but it's also rather vague. Within that definition, it's referenced non-native, and that brings up the question of what exactly is a native plant. Now, in Eric Tonesmeyer's Perennial Vegetables, he asks this question, and he says the native plant movement in the United States and Canada generally defines native as a plant that was growing here in 1492. But plant populations move and always have. Plants have traveled around the globe, often dispersed far by flying birds. It seems likely that the bottle gourds floated across the Atlantic Ocean from West Africa to South America thousands of years ago and established themselves there. Climate change causes tremendous movements of plants. 15,000 years ago, my garden was burned under a mile-high glacier, and North Florida was home to spruce forests similar to those that you would now find north of Montreal. Eric goes on to say, in the same section where the title of this specific paragraph is Scapegoating Invasive Plants, it's not invasive plants that damned western rivers. They didn't cause global warming or acid rain either. Short-term thinking motivated by greed has caused tremendous damage to our world's ecological systems. When we turn our eyes solely on invasive plants, we miss the real cause of ecological destruction. Governments and corporations acting for short-term profit to benefit a tiny segment of the population. These plants may be a mechanism for the loss of diversity due to disturbance, but they are not its cause. This is so incredibly important to think about. When it comes to invasives, they really have become this big target word of, where we pour all this money into, and it's sort of like, where else could we be looking to solve the root of the problem? The word invasive is way more complex than it is listed as in the dictionary, I'm sure. So if I was going to come up with sort of a quick description, it would be, yes, a plant that can really take over and also have really negative impacts on the surrounding ecosystem. When we think of invasive, we immediately think of bad. Maybe we should come up with a new word for invasives that actually aren't that bad, but they do spread aggressively and are potentially concerning for some reasons, but they also have good things associated with them. I would say that a truly invasive plant is one that just decimates a landscape and then doesn't really do anything to benefit that landscape whatsoever or benefit the people who rely on the landscape. As one random example, there's a perennial pea vine that is all over the eastern United States, and it's entirely poisonous, but it's pretty, it's great for pollinators, and it is a nitrogen fixing perennial sprawling vine. So it does benefit the landscape, perhaps, but it's also super invasive. And in the western United States, it's just really taking over and doing horrible things. In the eastern United States, not as much. I don't actually know too much about it, but it is a species that I have observed taking over many different varieties of ecosystems in Cape Cod and also in Maine.
Well, it's a very niche plant to know all about the ecology and the ecosystems that it inhabits. So don't feel too bad. I don't even know which vine you're talking about.
I think it's Lathyrus.
Yeah. I know the genus, but I don't know there's like Lathyrus palustris, and I think there's Japonica, and
this one is Lathyrus latifolius.
Oh, okay.
Perennial pea. It has these beautiful purple flowers. Pollinators love it. but it's a pea vine that is not edible, and it really is super invasive in certain environments where it shouldn't be,
Yeah.
or even ones where it's even invasive in environments where it's native to. The idea of an invasive being from an entirely different location is also kind of false. You can have invasives that are natives as well.
Right. And I think they cross over, right? Like there's the idea of a native plant being that, and it's a little bit arbitrary, but native plant is one that evolved in that region. You could pick a date to say if it was found in this date or before, then it's native to this area. But just because a plant is native to a specific region doesn't mean it's not necessarily invasive. I would even argue that something like Solidago in certain areas, it's native to North America, but it can really overtake certain areas. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad plant, but it's just invasive sort of describes the growth habit in a particular environment. And native refers more to the history of the plant and where it originated from. So yeah, idea of the native and exotic is different than something that's invasive versus a plant that sort of behaves itself in a particular landscape. And then endemic, as far as I'm aware, is more of a term for if a plant is native to an environment, but also it's not really found other places besides that environment. It's sort of only found in situ in its native range.
So one thing that I think we should also sort of touch upon before we get too deep into this discussion is also the way that plants spread and potentially become invasive. Just for our listeners, obviously we know that plants set seed. Some plants set seed and self-sow themselves very vigorously, whereas others do not. Some plants have fruits that are eaten by birds, and then the birds spread the seeds around very vigorously. But then there's also plants that spread by rhizome, which is essentially an underground branch or sort of root similar to a root structure that is actually potentially the most aggressive in terms of plants to look out for. Beware of rhizome spreaders. But then there's also things that send out runners. Probably most people are most familiar with strawberries that send out runners. Runners can also be almost as aggressive as rhizome spreading plants. And then lastly, there's plants that clump, which is probably the most chill in terms of perennials that are going to grow and take over your landscape. A clump, you're pretty safe with a clumping plant, because if it's going to take over a meadow, it's going to take like 100 years or whatever, whereas a plant that spreads by rhizome, it could take 15 years.
A good example of that is bamboo. There's some clumping. Bamboo in particular is very, very well known for running across the landscape and being very invasive, but there are clumping varieties like rufa that, like you said, they're chill, they behave themselves, you can manage them. They still grow fast, but they won't grow underneath some other patch and pop out on the other side of the driveway or spread into your neighbor's yard. You can actually see the growth happening concentrically. So we've defined some terms a little bit, and I think today is going to have a lot of like devil's advocacy for maybe on my side especially. I like to kind of bounce around and kind of argue both sides of the coin, but maybe we'll start with sort of the importance of native plants in the landscape. I think that might be a good place to start, but then we'll maybe talk about the limitations of native plants in a food producing forest garden, where our priority is to be growing certain plants that produce food or medicine, and the limitations of native plants. And of course, native is relative to whether you're in the Southeast US or in Europe or Asia. When it comes to native plants, so there's a couple different benefits that come to mind. One being that, especially if you're starting out as a food forest designer or a gardener, they're safe bets because they've evolved in a particular region over thousands and millions of years, of course, and so they're going to be a bit more well suited to the temperature fluctuations, the precipitation fluctuations. Also, they're going to be playing a role in the ecosystem more likely than some exotic plant, because those relationships again have developed over many, potentially thousands of years between the plants and the insects and the plants and the birds and all of the interconnections of the ecosystem. So those are the two main points for me. One is like the hardiness, the resiliency of native plants that in most cases holds up because of that relationship between the plant and the land. And then the second being the ecosystem justification. If we're trying to plant gardens that produce food but also provide wildlife habitat, wildlife food sources, I think it's helpful to find native plants that fulfill both of those niches. But I think the limitation for me for native plants is that, if we want to really maximize the amount of food production, there are certainly some species that we can work with. I'm speaking from, Midwest North America or Southeast North America, Northeast North America. For me, there's a limitation to the number of species that are going to be big producers. So I like to think about, like, if we go into our yards to make a meal or to eat off the landscape and we only choose native species, okay, so what would that look like? So in my landscape, there is, as far as trees go, black walnut, pecan, pawpaw, red mulberry. There's certainly more, I'm sure. I mean, you could talk about acorns and oaks, but those take a lot of processing. In the understory, we have things like blueberries. Even in North America, Concord grapes are native. Not everyone knows that. Acorn squash is native to North America and northern Mexico. So there certainly are options. Cranberry, all these ones are coming to mind. But at a certain point, you run out after maybe a dozen species that come to mind. Sure, there's plenty of more edible native plant species, but in terms of ones that can really produce high amounts of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, it's a fairly short list when you consider the breadth of the global diversity of food producing plant species for temperate climates. But I do think we should start there, especially when it comes to trees. I think in food forest designs, we should start with native tree species. The other layers, if you're familiar with the different layers of the food forest, I think are less important to get those perfectly right and try to highlight native species in those layers. But I think as far as the overstory canopy, I want to see things like native nut trees, native berry trees, acorns, or even trees that aren't necessarily food producers, but are just really great for wildlife. Black cherry is another one. That one does produce a little bit of food, but that's sort of my take. Like, I draw the line there. I think food forest designers should try to, maximize the amount of native canopy species in their designs. And then you can fill in all the other gaps and have some fun with plants from Europe and Asia or all over the world. So, Mike, I guess I'll turn that question on you now. As far as native species, why do you think they're important to include in a food forest? And at what point do you see their limitations start to emerge?
Very good question. So I pretty much agree with just about everything that you said in terms of always selecting natives first. Overstory should usually probably be native and ideally a native nut tree species. I guess when it comes to the limitations of natives, it really probably has a lot to do with harvest windows. And so, for example, like when we introduce non-natives into our landscape in food forest design, it's often to accomplish having something fruiting at all times throughout the growing season. This is something that is very easy to accomplish in tropical locations, but in temperate climates, like where I live in the Northeast, if all you have planted in your landscape is the traditional go-tos like blueberries or raspberries, your harvest window is somewhat limited. So introducing things like currants or gooseberries or lingonberries, the list goes on, can really extend those harvest windows and make it so that we're eating something all summer long and potentially into the fall. When you start to introduce things beyond just fruiting shrubs, that harvest window just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The reason to source native plants is essentially the same reason why the land race exists. The native plant, in essence, is going to function much better in your landscape and already have an established relationship with everything around it. Whereas if you were to source a plant that was non-native, it probably would struggle. Keep in mind, however, that these non-native plants, although they may be less adapted to your landscape at first, frequently you'll know pretty quickly if they've adapted and gotten a hold establishing themselves in the landscape. They're usually going to thrive. It's not across the board that every one of these plants is going to struggle for their entire lives. It's just more of a response to the extremes of your climate. So maybe a native species will understand that in the summertime, temps can hit 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and this non-native plant has never experienced temperatures that high and really gets burnt out in the summertime. But then in the fall, comes back real strong and has a later crop of berries. These are things that we can't entirely predict or plan for always, but as a rule of thumb, it's very important to get stuff in the ground early in the season and just understand how your plants interact with the landscape around them by doing your research and really reading up on them.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we talk a little bit about the interaction of plants and trees to the ecosystem specifically. And there's a researcher and author, Doug Tallamy, who I really respect, who's written a lot and done a lot of work on caterpillar diversity in various tree canopies and other ecosystems, because caterpillars and other invertebrates are sort of the backbone of a lot of ecosystems, and they feed primarily on leaves. He's actually ranked out the different tree species and woody shrub species by genus, and basically did some research to determine how many species of caterpillars can survive on leaves from that genus. And the idea is the higher level of caterpillar diversity, caterpillars of moths and butterflies, that sort of thing, that's going to mean higher levels of bird diversity and mammal diversity and reptile, and basically all the way down the ecosystem food chain is going to have a lot more biodiversity and then stability, of course, because the more diversity in a system, the more stable you are. You're not dependent on any one species. And he argues that, it really does come down to species selection in your landscape. And he notes that something like oaks can support 557 species of caterpillars, and something like a tulip poplar can support 20. So there's a huge discrepancy there. I'm looking at the list now, and even things like spicebush, which is native, is even less, like 11. So it's not always that native is going to provide more, but on the whole, some native species can really benefit the ecosystem. Although I will say that this is on the genus level, so you might have some species that are native to your landscape and some that aren't. I talked to Doug about this because in the case of oaks, 557 species of caterpillars, it's a lot, but that's globally, right? And there's many species of oaks, and so that's why the level of numbers of caterpillar species that it can be a host for is also so high. So that list is kind of, I think it's important to consider, but I wouldn't take any of those numbers to heart or any of those lists to heart. But the important takeaways there are that things like oaks and black cherry, crab apples, native to North America, those are providing, massive amounts of leaf matter to caterpillars. And that's really important for, like I said, things like bird diversity. So take chickadees, for example. They have to find 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to rear one clutch of young. So it's a pair of them. So the parents are working together. But that's an insane amount of caterpillars, and that requires a lot of leaf matter for those caterpillars to eat. So without the leaves, we don't get the caterpillars. Without the caterpillars, we don't get the birds. There's ripple effects in the ecosystem. And we were talking about pawpaws. So pawpaws are a important food source. Their leaves are an important food source. They're an important host plant to the zebra swallowtail butterfly. I've done some foraging for pawpaws, and it's kind of beautiful. You're in this pawpaw patch, and there's these like really unique black and white zebra swallowtails flying around, and you don't see them anywhere else in the landscape near me. I don't believe that they have other plants that they can host their young on. So the butterflies themselves, they're not eating the leaves, but they're young. They lay their eggs in the leaves, and the eggs and the larvae are specialists on the particular leaves of the pawpaw. Not much else can eat leaves of pawpaw trees. So there's this idea that many times insects can be specialists to a particular genus, and sometimes a particular species of tree leaves. And so if you don't have that one particular genus in the landscape, you're not going to have that one particular group of insects. So that's why it's helpful when you're selecting your species to select for a broad variety of genera. I guess I'll leave that there. I think the other point with Doug Tallamy to look into is his concern as we start to move this conversation over to exotic plants and invasive plants. His concern is that even though there's an argument that says that, hey, just because this plant isn't native doesn't mean it can't provide food for insects, for birds, for mammals, that sort of thing, which is very true. I mean, something like autumn olive. I mean, birds will eat autumn olive and gumi, and I'm certain that mammals will too, and lots of other organisms. But his argument is essentially that if the animal or insect hasn't developed a long evolutionary history with that plant, they may be able to eat it and consume it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the healthiest food for them chemically. And there may be negative interactions, and it might just be the wrong time of year for maybe those species of birds eating autumn olive shouldn't be eating high sweet carbohydrate rich berries in the fall. Maybe they need to be stocking up on fatty foods because it can signal their brains to migrate, or these sort of considerations. And I'm kind of speaking more vaguely here, but I think his work kind of delves into that world more and says, like, okay, well, if we bring in exotics, then they may be able to provide food and nectar, but it might be the wrong timing and the wrong chemical constitution. So there's all these things that are important to consider. I think maybe we start to think about the exotic and invasive question, because in my garden, I definitely plant a lot of things that are not native for a number of different reasons. Like I said, I try to make the tree species native to my region, but lots of other things aren't. But thankfully, if you're in a cold climate, you can grow plants that aren't native, that are from the tropics, for example, and those will die in the winter. But there's plenty of examples of non-native plants that you could have in your food forest. Like, let's talk about something like water celery, which I know you enjoy as well, Mike, which is a very invasive plant that can survive winter. It's one of the first plants to pop out of the snow, and it's going to come back year after year. And even though it's a wonderful vegetable that provides massive amounts of food and nutritious food, it could become a real problem and potentially escape the forest garden and get into surrounding areas. What are
Yeah.
some of your, do you have any like horror stories or problem child plants that you've planted but maybe wish that you didn't plant them as much as you did?
Sadly, I do. And so I have quite a bit to say about that, and water celery is on my list. But water celery is one of the ones that I've observed in other people's forest gardens not being as invasive as I've heard it being. So I'm slightly happy so far with the results on that. I guess we'll find out over time as it takes over the wet area, the wet meadow that I planted it in. But before I get into the few plants that I want to talk about, one of them being water celery, I would like to sort of go off on a slight diversion in terms of the reasons why people are considering even planting non-natives or potentially invasive plants in the first place. Sometimes there are very good reasons, as Ben has pointed out to some degree. I'd like to talk about mulberry as an example. So mulberry is one of the oldest trees to be cultivated in the history of humankind, at least that I'm aware of. It was originally cultivated for silkworms in Asia. It's now naturalized in North America, but it is not native. And although mulberry may or may not be on specific invasive lists, It definitely is a weed tree that gets spread around everywhere by birds. It'll pop up in your landscape without you planting it 4 times over in a year. So, once again, back to that definition of what is invasive, it might not be nearly as invasive as something like water celery. I still consider it somewhat a good example in this regard. In certain silvopasture systems, silvopasture is essentially a new way of looking at raising pigs or fowl or other types of animals that usually would be found in a CAFO these days, not a barnyard. There are a few design methods that include mulberry in the landscape, specifically to feed pigs in a silvopasture kind of setup. And mulberry is an interesting tree because it has edible fruit, it has edible leaves, and there are certain varieties of mulberry that will fruit for sometimes like 2 months or more. So they really can provide a lot of food for humans, but let's say that there's certain varieties of trees where the berries aren't super tasty to humans, they're going to be tasty to pigs. You know, it's kind of a creative solution, basically. In dealing with climate change, something that we need to come up with are more creative solutions. So when we just see XYZ plant as, oh, that's invasive, we obviously shouldn't use it here, and immediately write it off, I see that as a problem. And in the grand scheme of things, it's possible that some of these problems could be the solution, especially when it comes to the mulberry example in silvopasture. Now, when it comes to some of the things to like horror stories, when it comes to horror stories or things that could potentially be horror stories, you really want to just think about the plants that you're purchasing, how they're going to benefit you, and how they are going to spread throughout the landscape. The first thing to look at is if it's a rhizome spreader. And my first sort of horror story potentially to talk about is Fuki, or Pedicites japonicus, also Pedicites japonicus var giganteum. So Fuki is a perennial vegetable frequently foraged for in Japan. It's very popular in Japan. It's a very interesting ornamental plant in general. There are some pretty cute photos of little Japanese kids using the stalks and the leaves as umbrellas while they're like waiting to get picked up for school. So I guess it has that function. But Fuki is kind of scary because it spreads via rhizome, and it can spread as far as like 10 feet in a single year underground and pop up in a place that you did not plan to plant it in. It at first seems like a really badass perennial vegetable, but then you sort of later on learn that it's sort of bitter. It has some toxicity issues that are somewhat related to potentially very dangerous alkaloids and liver cancer. It just so happens that there is a high amount of liver cancer in Japan in general, which is, as alarming when you think like, oh, it's eaten widely in Japan. Well, there, lots of perennial vegetables have sketchy compounds in them that you shouldn't generally be consuming these things every single day. It's, okay to have it every once in a while, just like how you wouldn't eat a certain type of mushroom every single day for your entire life. Things can build up in your body and have negative side effects. Fuki is one of those for sure. All of this would be fine if not for the fact that it spreads aggressively in almost every scenario except incredibly dry soil and like full sun. It likes to have, I have mine in dry shade, and I'm hoping that that contains it somewhat. But this past weekend, I was visiting a garden center in, let's see, East Granby, Connecticut, where it was the biggest Fuki patch I've ever seen in my life. It was probably 50 feet by 30 feet or more. And I asked the guy who planted it, the owner, was just like, so that Fuki patch, looks pretty cool. It's really, really beautiful. Makes it feel like it's a tropical landscape. How long ago did you plant that? And like, what'd you do? And he just held up a gallon bucket, or not even like a quart size bucket. And he said, I planted one plant 15 years ago.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. And it was in a wetlands in the shade, which is exactly what it wants. Fuki generally grows in inundated areas. And not to totally hate on Fuki, it definitely has some uses, but somewhat recently I heard that our plant nerd god Eric Tonesmeyer ripped out his Fuki plants, which were nicely contained originally, I believe, in like a rhizome barrier at Paradise Lot, which don't quote me on that. I think I remember seeing that in some video that they had it within a rhizome barrier. But basically, he ripped them out because he recognized that there was some studies done that showed that the harmful alkaloids could actually be transferred from Fuki to other surrounding edible plants, which is like super freaky. It's just like, what? Like, how did I don't know. It just goes to
Yeah,
show.
I didn't believe that when you said it, and then as we were talking, I didn't just Google it, but went onto a journal article and found the study that found that the particular alkaloids would transport, which is strange. I've never heard of alkaloids moving from one plant into another plant.
Very, very disturbing.
Yeah.
And we definitely talked about this a number of times on this podcast, so I don't want to beat it to death. But yes, Fuki is one of those perennial vegetables that you probably find out about pretty quickly when you delve into cold climate permaculture. And it's also maybe one to wait and see if you have a friend who grew it in a certain scenario and it worked out okay. It's, treat it like bamboo. If you decide to put it in the ground, put a 2 to 3 foot deep piece of plastic surrounding that plant so that it cannot escape. If essentially it's a rhizome barrier, that's one thing that's useful, is that it's not a plant. Fuki is a plant that sends out underground rhizomes. It doesn't send out underground rhizomes and runners, so it's not going to send out these shoots laterally like above ground. It's only going to be underground, so you can contain it in that way. But it's just kind of a bitch to dig up 3 feet of soil and then put in this big plastic thing, and then
I will say too, I know Dave Jackie, the author of Edible Forest Gardens, did a Facebook post not too long ago about how he went back to his original home where he planted a bamboo patch and did put in a rhizome barrier. I don't know how deep it was, but I got the impression that he did it properly. And after probably was, maybe a decade later, he went back and found some bamboo that had escaped somehow, either below or above, and got outside of the well-constructed rhizome barrier. So even those aren't totally foolproof. But I mean, that's the minimum though, if you're going to be planting something that's invasive, aggressively invasive, to put one of those in.
The plants don't read the books. But
that's definitely true.
Moving on to water celery, Oenanthe javanica, or water celery, which Ben previously talked about. It sends out runners that easily root in wet soils. I kind of look to it as a potential ground cover for my wet meadow forest garden, but it is something that you should be very careful of in planting it in places where it could potentially overrun native forests, especially if it's in a wet place. Something to consider is that, water celery, okay, it wants to be in a wet spot. Well, it's possible that it'll survive in a dry spot and be kept in check. That's something that I decided to do with the Fuki. I planted it in a dry place, thinking that maybe it won't take over as much as if it was in ideal conditions. So dealing with these plants in certain ways, you can sort of overcome some of their invasive qualities. But water celery is something that's very tasty, and I wouldn't really mind it taking over the area that I planted it in, which currently is just growing a ridiculous amount of creeping Charlie. The creeping Charlie is taking over there, and water celery tastes a lot better than creeping Charlie. So it's it's also not obnoxious. I mean, Fuki can become a huge giant plant that you really can't walk or wade through without it being somewhat difficult. But water celery is like a ground cover that you can basically step on. It's just something that, once again, you have to consider. You don't want to be taking water celery and then putting it into a wet native forest and walking away. You want to have control in some regard over the system, and also think about what could potentially happen in 100 years when you're gone. Hopefully you've planted it somewhere that there is some sort of barrier to prevent it from really becoming invasive, because that's the thing that we want to consider here. The last plant that I want to talk about, really, I mean, I could talk about a few other things like running comfrey, or even like other natives that are potentially invasive, like sunchokes, which maybe we can do later. But chameleon plant, which is Houtunia cordata, is...
Oh no.
Do you have something to talk about here with Houtunia cordata as well?
I didn't know it was called chameleon plant, but when you said the Latin name, hot tuna,
Oh yeah.
for those who aren't familiar with it, the Latin name. Uh, what did you call it? Is it Hatuna something?
So I mean, when it comes to Latin names, I am not good at the correct pronunciation. I mean, I guess you'd have to take Latin to always know the way that it's pronounced. And
Hatunia.
I think
Hatunia.
I thought it was Hotunia, but it could be Hoptunia. But yeah,
Hot.
Hotunia. I've
Yeah.
always Hotunia cordata is the way that I've always said it.
There's a slang term or vernacular term, I guess, common name. There we go. Besides chameleon plant, also called hot tuna. At least that's how it was told to me, and that tells you something about what it smells like and tastes like. Once I determined that that was an accurate name, it made me not want to grow this anymore. Actually, also reading about how aggressive it was. I grew it for maybe 2 days in my yard and then ripped it out.
Well, you potentially were smarter than I was. So yeah, so chameleon plant, hot tuna, Petunia cordata. It's not officially on the USDA invasive list, which is something to note here, but it is globally recorded on the global invasive list. And part of the reason why certain plants are on the invasive list in the first place is it usually has to do with their popularity, and often their popularity as like an ornamental, because the way that plants are being put in landscapes in the modern world is usually as part of somebody's landscaping gig. So if you have an Aralia tree that's planted in a landscape and then becomes invasive in that area, it's often because somebody was hired to make that area really pretty and didn't recognize the plant was potentially invasive. But so Petunia cordata or chameleon plant is an ornamental often used in people's aquatic gardens, in wetlands that, are not wetlands that are at risk. Usually it's like something like a goldfish pond. And then 10 years later, there's nothing around except Petunia cordata or hot tuna. Not so long ago, I was visiting a friend's food forest. He had quite a bit of it as a ground cover, and I was like, "Oh, that's that chameleon plant." And he's like, "Yeah, that one was a mistake. We can't smother it. It doesn't taste good. It, I don't know, like that was one that I don't recommend." And I was like, "Oh crap, I already planted that."
Well, you still have time. You can go back on it now and pull it up if you need to. But I should mention that it is an edible, and it's commonly used in salads and cooked with vegetables and meats in China, and it has a fishy taste, and that's why I don't like it. I don't like fish sauce or anything. But if you like fish sauce and in your pad thai, and you're a fan of those sorts of weird flavors, maybe you can experiment growing it in like a controlled setting. So it does have its use. It's got edible flowers too for tea, but yeah, it's almost, it seems like unless you can't grow anything else, I would probably choose something else.
And that's the thing, is that I do enjoy, I enjoy sushi. I like the taste of seaweed. I eat oysters. I love many types of fish, even though now, thanks to relevant Netflix documentaries, apparently I'm destroying the earth by eating fish, but that's a whole different side thing. Yeah, I read all of that about chameleon plant, and I was like, wow, that sounds great. I would like something that would be good in soups as a fishy taste, or if you can use a little bit of it, similar to lovage. Like lovage is a really overpowering celery flavor. You could just use a small amount, but it is something also to really sort of be aware that if you're going to plant it, especially in a wet site, you really don't want to be the guy who took over 100 square feet in 10 years with Petunia cordata that is just like displacing whatever native ground cover would be there in the first place. Unless, potentially if you're in a place where there already is a super invasive ground cover that also has really negative effects like stinging you or giving you rashes or something like that, then that might be potentially an okay choice, but still probably not. It'd probably be better to try to smother everything that's there and then plant a native species.
Absolutely. Yeah. I almost forgot about that species, the Hatunia. So thanks for dredging that one up from my past. I do want to make a case for maybe the quote unquote invasives or the exotics in food forests, unless you have another species you wanted to talk about as an invasive.
So, I mean, I can also make the case, but I'd like to hear yours first. I'd say that we should go with whatever you have to say, and then maybe I'll add on to it. And the only other things that I could really talk about are like comfrey, different types of comfreys, and then sunchokes, which are near impossible to remove, but are also a native plant. Kind of just to point out that natives are can also be invasive in spreaders, like even just raspberries spread via underground rhizomes. But
Yeah, Jerusalem artichokes are a great example of a native plant that can get out of hand, and it might take a lot of work, years of work, to remove a patch if you have one that you don't want there anymore. So yeah, that's definitely one that any permaculture gardener who's gotten one tuber of Jerusalem artichoke probably still has that tuber. And I don't know, I'm not a huge fan of them. Maybe I just haven't prepared them properly, but there's also lots of cultivars, so maybe I just need to find the right cultivar. But that would be great, right? Like being able to have a perennial tuber potato that's native that will just grow on year after year and that you could eat to your heart's content. But yeah, it doesn't seem like it's fit the bill quite precisely for me yet, just because I'm not a huge fan of the taste.
did you ever get a chance to try Clearwater as the cultivar?
I don't think so. I was given an unnamed cultivar, and so I don't know which one I had, or if it was supposedly any good, or if it was more of a wild type.
Some of the wild types, like PJ's Wild, I think I have, but Clearwater is usually the one that if you're at some health food store that has sunchokes out of whatever weird whim that they actually have sunchokes, it's almost always Clearwater because it is the best tasting one. At like
Okay.
the same way that people have decided that those 4 hosta varieties are the best tasting ones. And I planted out a bunch of the Clearwater ones, so maybe in September we can have like a tasting. But one thing to our listeners is sunchokes are kind of a perennial potato substitute. They're actually really a type of sunflower that creates a tuber underground, and people have selected and bred through natural breeding processes to get the best tasting tuber. It does have a lot of, I believe, inulin in it, which is something that makes you fart. So some people call them fart chokes. And I haven't, and they make you fart if you have eaten a lot of them. Essentially, if you eat a small amount, you won't have some big reaction. But I haven't ever had enough that, I have had any reaction from them. That is a big thing in the permaculture community in terms of why people are like, sunchokes, like I don't like the taste and it makes me fart.
I think
Aside,
it comes down to like the preparation too. I think I've read some literature on the sort of historical way those plants were prepared by Native Americans, just long, slow, low heat pits of cooking them can break down a lot of that fiber that otherwise your gut bacteria would have trouble breaking down.
it's true that from what I've read, lots of cooking methods from Native Americans involved a really, really long, low heat, really just cooking in ways that the modern brain can't even comprehend. But yeah, so sunchokes are just a great example of something that is native to North America, but it does multiply and take over areas in a relatively aggressive fashion, and it's impossible to remove. It's almost impossible to smother. If you plant it in your landscape, know that that is going to be your sunchoke patch for until the end of time. It's very similar to if you plant comfrey. Comfrey has a taproot. If you rip out every little piece of comfrey root that you can find, I guarantee you the next year there's still going to be comfrey growing. And if it's a running comfrey, then it's going to be even worse of a situation. Similarly to sunchokes, in terms of other natives or things that we don't think of as quote unquote invasives, almost every plant in the rubus genus, with the exception of blackberries. And so what I'm talking about here is raspberries, every type of raspberry that you've heard of, whether it be golden, red, different cultivars, they all send out underground rhizomes. If you plant a raspberry in your landscape, it's going to spread. I mean, so long as you don't kill it in the first year somehow, it's going to spread, and it's going to potentially take over the area that you planted it in a way that you didn't plan for, which isn't horrible. I mean, I wouldn't consider that raspberries are, raspberries are obviously not quote unquote invasives. They're not going to destroy the landscape around it, but they are going to potentially get a little out of hand, and they have thorns, like just the way that we perceive invasives in the modern era doesn't make too much sense to me, because if, when we're deciding that raspberries aren't invasive, but XYZ thing is, like, I don't know.
Sure. Kind of to tag off of that, the case I'm going to make for the quote unquote invasives or the exotics kind of goes back to the limitations of native plants. I would be more impressed if someone said they want to plant native only in their forest garden if that person eats a predominantly native food diet, meaning, maybe for your breakfast, you're having acorn flour pancakes with serviceberry syrup or something like that. But, most people aren't eating a high native food diet, right? Like we might be growing some native plants in our backyard and feeling great about it. But then we go to the store because we can't produce enough food. We go to the store and buy it, or the farmer's market and buy it. And with your dollar, you're basically commissioning someone else to either tear down forest or native habitat to plant farmland and grow, wheat or corn or soy or even organic vegetables that come from, some other place and that aren't native to your region. And so I would rather grow those things in my yard in an ecosystem rather than, and even if that means they aren't native, rather than, having to go and buy food from a really long way away and have that food grown elsewhere. So even if I'm not growing an all native yard, I'm still reducing my ecological footprint. And granted, as long as I'm following some of those guidelines that you talked about, Mike, as far as being responsible with how we grow them, especially if it's something that is highly invasive. And a lot of these plants, like these berry plants that come from Asia, like autumn olive or gumi, these are really or sea buckthorn. These are very, very healthy plants and extremely high levels of antioxidants, lycopene, and minerals. And I think it's in a time where we need all the help we can get health wise. And yes, blueberries and serviceberries are great for us, but they're only available a certain time of the year, and they aren't quite as ferocious, I guess I would say, as some of these other plants like Nanking cherry or something like that. And so I think we really need to be growing as much as we can, as much food as possible in our landscape to share with each other, to eat for ourselves, to store. You can be feeding them to your animals in some cases as well. And they're really, really powerful tools. And so I wouldn't feel right, like, recommending natives only if that's limiting the amount of healthy food that is available to the world, right? And so, yes, there's ecological implications, but at the very least, I think there's a trade-off, right? So I think back to Ben Falk with a post that he made, how I think he was at a health food store and he was there to pick autumn olives, which for people who aren't familiar, it's a nitrogen fixing shrub that produces a edible sweet and sour red berry in the fall. And I think they asked him to leave or something, or to stop hanging out in the parking lot picking the weeds, because there was like this, a bunch of shrubbery next to the parking lot that was just sort of a wild forest edge, or maybe it was growing in the medians in the parking lot, and they thought he was loitering. And so I think if I'm remembering it correctly, they made him, stop picking these random berries in the parking lot. And he thought it was sort of ironic that he's picking berries for free that are probably healthier than any supplement that is being sold in the health food store, or any of the food that was shipped in from sometimes far away that health food stores and other grocery stores sell. And here it is, this beautiful patch of fresh, healthy food, and just it's kind of ironic that people are walking right by them every day to go into the grocery store to buy food that's probably not going to be as nutritious. So there's just that irony. I was actually at a grocery store the other day, and there were in the landscaping of the parking lot, there were peach trees. They weren't quite ready yet, but I'm almost certain that those just drop to the ground and get thrown out. Like people are walking right by them to go into the store to buy peaches, which is just so backwards. So I guess all that to say, that's something that I think people need to take into account when they're deciding, do I want to plant natives or natives only, or do I want to incorporate plants from other ecosystems? Because if you say natives only, you are going to be reducing the amount of food that you can grow in terms of a full season. Like there'll be patches where you can't grow and be eating out of your garden and producing as much as if you incorporated some plants from other parts of the world. And then there's a consequence to that, because if you're not eating as much off your land, you're buying from somewhere else, which has its own ecological implications. So that's sort of like I kind of bounced around in this episode from benefits of natives, the benefits of invasives, and the drawbacks of each. And I think that was sort of the goal. There's not really a bias, or I'm not really trying to convince people one way or the other. It's just to think more deeply about their food choices in general.
Yeah, I would say that, reducing your food miles is a really good place to start. And it's a good point that if you're going to be reducing your food miles in general, or taking that into consideration when you're deciding to plant a food forest in your backyard, that, growing non-natives and eating them in your backyard rather than buying them at your local Safeway is the better option. Even if it's not a native tree, think about the amount of carbon and fossil fuels that went into producing and transporting that food that you're purchasing. Another great example of sort of a misunderstanding of a once seemingly invasive or dangerous plant species is the ribes genus in the United States, which is, currants and gooseberries. In, I think, like the early 1900s or sometime in the 20th century, currants were banned because they passed on like a blight to the eastern white pine. And our idea was, okay, we're going to get rid of every currant. Currants are not allowed to be cultivated because at the time white pine was a lumber crop. And that sort of ban stuck for a really, really, really long time, even past the point that anybody cares about chopping down white pine. It's not really a big lumber crop anymore. Still, I think in Maine, you officially can't grow currants because it's just a law that has yet to be removed. I should also add, and it's important to point out here, that the blight that was introduced through the European black currant, which is Ribes nigrum, and it was especially susceptible to this disease, and that's mostly what caused the transfer from the white to the white pines. There are currants that are native to North America, but in this case, it was the European varieties. When you talk about a non-native species that produces and provides you food throughout the entire growing season, currants are where it's at. You can get multiple varieties of currants, whether they be black, red, white, pink, and they have fruiting windows that cover the entire summer. You can really start eating one bush of currants in May and stop eating another one in September, growing in the north, maybe in New York or New England or in potentially many other climates. I mean, mostly I talk about a zone 6 climate, but this is obviously it's a range. So for 100 years, currants were entirely overlooked as a source of nutrition, as a source of tons of different important vitamins. And now just finally, there's sort of been this renaissance in currants cultivation. I think a lot, mostly to do with like winery popularity. People have started making currant wines. Black currant wine is sold at an extreme premium at any winery I've ever been to. It's almost as expensive as ice wine. So thank you wineries for bringing currants into the mix, I guess, despite charging me so much for it. But it's just something to consider that, all of these plants that we're talking about today, especially when it comes to like the berries and the fruiting shrubs, planting them in your landscape is always better than going to the grocery store and then buying a blueberry or strawberry or whatever. Unless it was literally, produced like a mile away from you, it is always better to be growing it in your backyard, or if you're in an apartment building, potentially on your roof, or on your, whatever, your front step. These are the things that we need to start to really recognize and realize that when we go to the grocery store and we buy our food, there is a serious dollar sign and fossil fuel carbon emission tag to what we purchase.
Couldn't agree more. And just to tag on to that too, there's this idea that, when you go to the farmers market, which farmers markets are great. I go to mine quite a bit, but even then, if the farm is from far away and they have to drive their, crate of apples all the way to the farmers market, and we all are driving our cars all the way to the farmers market, in some cases, the economies of scale dictate that that's not a very good use of fossil fuels. And instead, one gigantic truck full of food driving to your grocery store, even though that food might have been produced a lot further away, it's still economies of scale would dictate that it's a better use of fossil fuels, because per calorie or per bite of food, you're getting less of a carbon impact than if you ate quote unquote locally. But I think there's a threshold. So if the farm is further than 25 miles away, more or less, from the farmers market, depending on the amount of food that they're bringing, on average, if it's further away than that, you might be better off getting your food from the local grocery store, or hopefully an independent grocery store. But I know that's kind of controversial and there's a lot to that, but I thought of that statistic and wanted to include it there. That's all I have on the native plant and the invasive plant controversy. Do you have anything else you wanted to cover?
I think we really, we hashed it out. I would say to any of our listeners, if you made it this far, Perennial Vegetables by Eric Tonesmeyer has an interesting segment in the book about invasives and natives, and that's where I was first introduced to the controversy, I guess would be the way to put it. So, understanding your relationship to that word invasive is very important, and I would start there. Maybe after Perennial Vegetables, our listeners could check out this book called The Rambunctious Garden, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World. That's by Emma Maris. This book really kind of talks about the idea of like an Anthropocene, like an age that humans have sculpted. It's this idea that humans have now changed so much of the world that we've entered into an entire new age of biodiversity and ecological existence. And so it talks about a lot of different kind of interesting stories, where this one chapter just, it talks about a few different interesting stories related to all these things we've been talking about in this episode. So one example was in the book Rodriguez Island, which is a tiny islet in the Indian Ocean that in the 50s and 60s suffered really heavy deforestation. As a result, 3 native endemic species on the island, which were a species of fruit bat and then 2 songbirds, nearly went extinct as a result of that deforestation. These 3 species relied really heavily on the ecosystem services that all of the trees provided, primarily the fruit and nectar, and also insects and other things that thrived in the shade of the forest canopy. And without them, they were just toast. Like, they didn't stand a chance. And then a funny thing happened. In the 70s, the island was reforested with a menagerie of entirely introduced, quote-unquote, exotic or potentially invasive species, without like any regard given to specific conservation or ecology efforts. The trees were just essentially picked at random and were very fast-growing, opportunistic species. They populated the landscape and took over extremely quickly. They grew at supposedly lightning speed, and they dominated the landscape in a really rapid fashion, the way that invasive species famously do. Now, the result was that the population of the endangered species that were nearly extinct started coming back. There was a return in the populations for each of the 3 species that were nearly on the brink of extinction. The invasives saved the native endemic species by providing them with food and nectar again, and by doing it really, really quickly, because there was a limited time window that for these species to like be saved, basically, and the natives would maybe not have been able to pull it off because they just don't grow and take over the environment as quickly as all the invasives did. And ironically, the invasive plants were rewarded by being slowly, methodically removed from the landscape and replaced with native species. So, like the natives were taken out. They put invasive species in without really thinking about it. They saved these birds and this bat species, and now they're getting axed. And are like, well, you did your job, but get out of here. And because at a certain point, the conservationists realized how badly they messed up. So they decided, okay, now we're going to go back in and we're going to fix it. And their idea of fixing it was to bring in native species and just ignore the fact that these invasive plants provided incredible ecosystem services at like a really dire time. She also talks about other examples where invasives are really bad. So like on the flip side, we have to consider the idea of an introduced or invasive species outside of just plants. So outside of just the plant world, there are extremely harmful species out there that when introduced into biodiverse ecosystems, they can really mess it up. Often good examples of these are not necessarily plants always, but animals. So like feral cats usually have no predators and they'll just decimate populations, especially on islands. Same thing with feral pigs, like the feral pigs in Hawaii. And the example that she really harked on was the brown tree snake, which was accidentally introduced to Guam. I'm going to read directly from the book here. The brown tree snake, native to Australia and nearby countries, has killed 10 of 12 native forest-dwelling birds on the island of Guam after arriving as a stowaway on cargo ships. Not only have the birds disappeared, but their absence has had a cascading effect on many of the island's fruit trees, which used to be dispersed by the birds. An initial study suggests that thanks to the lack of avian dispersers, Guam's fruit trees will in the future cluster together in expanding single species rather than intermixing. So essentially, the introduction of the brown tree snake produced a monoculture effect on the fruit trees on the island, where on a flip side that she also highlights in Hawaii, has been discovered that exotic or introduced species of birds are actually assisting the native plants of Hawaii by dispersing their seeds across the landscape. And this is because in Hawaii, much of the native birds are no longer around to provide this service. So the exotic birds have basically stepped right in to fill this role. And despite the fact that they're non-native, they're still providing an invaluable ecosystem service and benefiting the native plants on the island, and also preventing the fruit tree monoculture that occurred in Guam. In the same chapter, once again, this is Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World, A Rambunctious Garden by Emma Maris. In that same chapter, she also talks about a story from Jamestown, in like historic Jamestown in America, in the United States, where they were trying to remove some quote-unquote invasives that were aquatic plants, and because they were invasives and they were so hard to remove, they introduced pesticides and herbicides to kill them, which is just so backwards. It just doesn't make any sense. But she ends the whole chapter with this little bit that I thought was pretty interesting. As the planet warms and adapts to human domination, it is the exotic species of the world that are busy moving, evolving, and forming new ecological relationships. The despised invaders of today may well be the keystone species of the future's ecosystems, if we give them the space to adapt and don't rush in and tear them out. Like, how crazy is that? How important? Like, it's so true. And this whole idea of, especially in like cities and urban areas, there's just certain trees that won't grow in spaces, and there's certain native plants that just won't grow in urban environments, especially because of all the different things that they're exposed to, like road salt and something like tree of heaven, which is an invasive species that is on a lot of banned lists and it pops up everywhere. Well, tree of heaven, even though it doesn't provide food for us, it provides other invaluable ecosystem services to humans and animals. Even something as simple as shade, just having a canopy in a city is important. So these are the types of things that, maybe we should have talked about a little bit more in this episode, and maybe we'll have a whole different episode kind of as a follow-up. But yeah, I'd say those two books for our listeners. Maybe check out Perennial Vegetables by Eric Tonesmeyer and The Rambunctious Garden, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World by Emma Maris.
Great. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you made it to the end here and learned something along the way. As always, thanks for subscribing to the podcast. If you're subscribed, feel free to rate us on the Apple Podcast app if you like what you heard. All right, until next time.